5 little-known true crime cases that need more attention. It was a quiet Sunday evening in the small seaside town of Nairn, Scotland, November 28, 2004. Christmas lights had just started to flicker on along the streets, and the Wilson household on Crescent Road was settling into a calm night. 30-year-old Alistair Wilson, a respected bank manager, had spent the weekend with his wife Veronica and their 2 young sons. The kids were upstairs in their pajamas. Dinner dishes were still in the sink. The air smelled faintly of the roast they'd eaten an hour earlier. It was an ordinary family night until the doorbell rang. Veronica answered it. Standing on the porch was a man she didn't recognize, middle-aged, wearing a dark jacket and a baseball cap pulled low. His voice was calm, polite. "Is Alistair Wilson here?" he asked. Thinking it was a neighbor or client, she went upstairs to fetch her husband. Alistair came down, still wearing his socks, confused but unbothered. He walked to the door, and within minutes, everything would change forever. Moments later, Veronica heard 3 gunshots. When she rushed back, the stranger was gone. Alistair was lying in the doorway, bleeding, clutching a small blue envelope in his hand with one word written on it: Paul. When police arrived, the street was eerily quiet. No one had seen the shooter clearly, and there were no security cameras to capture the scene. The murder weapon, a small semi-automatic pistol, would later be found discarded in a nearby drain, but the killer had vanished without a trace. The motive? Completely unknown. There were no signs of forced entry, no robbery, no history of threats. Alistair had no known enemies. He was a banker, not a criminal. Detectives immediately began questioning everyone: family, colleagues, neighbors, but what puzzled them most was the envelope. Why would a stranger hand Alistair something with another man's name before shooting him? At the hospital, Veronica told investigators every detail she could remember. The man was around 35 to 40, wearing a dark blue jacket and a baseball cap, calm, almost emotionless. And when he spoke, his voice was soft, not angry, not rushed. She remembered something else. The stranger had waited after asking for Alistair. He didn't seem nervous. He stood there like he knew exactly what would happen next. The town of Nairn wasn't used to murder, especially not something this calculated. The police flooded the area with patrols and door-to-door interviews. The weapon, a Hennel Schmeisser pistol, was an old German model dating back to World War II, extremely rare in the UK. It was traced to hundreds of potential sources, but led nowhere concrete. Meanwhile, locals whispered theories. Some said it was a case of mistaken identity. Maybe the killer had the wrong Wilson. Others speculated it was linked to Alistair's work at the bank. Rumors swirled about a construction project, unpaid debts, or even a dispute with a contractor, but none of it matched the precision of the killing. The Paul envelope became the central mystery. Detectives couldn't find any Paul connected to Alistair's life who fit the picture. It wasn't his middle name. It wasn't a colleague or client. Whoever Paul was real or coded his name had been the last thing Alistair saw before he died. By winter's end, the investigation hit a wall. Police had questioned over 5,000 people. No fingerprints, no DNA, no witnesses placed in the suspect's car. The only physical lead was that gun, and it was clean, wiped of any prints. Still, something strange emerged. Weeks before his death, Alistair had told his wife he'd been under pressure at work. He hadn't elaborated, just that something was wrong, and he didn't trust everyone around him. That vague statement sent detectives back to the bank. They combed through transactions, employee records, and client histories, but nothing screamed motive. Alistair had recently spoken against a proposal to change his branch into a different kind of commercial hub. Some colleagues said it caused tension, but enough to get a man killed? Unlikely. Veronica, haunted by the memory, said she believed her husband recognized the man at the door, if only for a split second. It wasn't fear, she said. It was confusion, like he knew him but couldn't believe he was there. That statement changed everything. Police reconstructed the timeline, and one detail stood out. The killer had arrived precisely at 7 p.m. when Alistair's routine was predictable. Someone had known he'd be home. Someone had known where he lived. The theory shifted from a random killing to a targeted execution. Forensic psychologists were brought in. They said the calmness of the encounter suggested the killer was either highly trained or emotionally detached. No rage, no panic, just purpose. Weeks turned into months. The case grew cold, the trail colder. But in 2005, a small discovery would reignite everything. A neighbor recalled seeing a man earlier that day walking near the Wilson house, pretending to look at his watch as if waiting. When police checked CCTV from nearby streets, they found nothing. But one witness, an elderly man walking his dog, claimed he saw a blue Vauxhall Astra idling by the corner around the time of the shooting. The registration number was never caught, but the car's driver may have been the one holding that gun. And when investigators dug deeper into Alistair's professional circle, one name kept appearing over and over again. It wasn't Paul. It was someone else entirely. The name that surfaced wasn't on the envelope. It wasn't Paul, but it was someone Alistair had quietly mentioned to a colleague in the weeks before he died. Someone who had recently caused tension at the bank. Someone connected to a development dispute that the Wilson family had never known about. It was the first real lead investigators had in months. But as detectives began to untangle Alistair's professional life, they discovered a man who, behind polite smiles and calm demeanor, had been under mounting pressure. Before his death, Alistair had been a business manager at the Bank of Scotland, a position that brought him respect and enemies. The town of Nairn was small, its economy built on tourism and construction, and the bank's decisions carried weight. If Alistair refused to approve a loan, it didn't just end a deal, it ended someone's dream. Police records later showed that, in the weeks before his murder, Alistair had been drawn into a heated conflict between local developers over a proposed hotel extension near his branch. One side wanted expansion, the other environmental preservation. The fight had grown bitter, even personal. Witnesses recalled Alistair being unusually tense. His co-workers noticed he'd begun locking his office door during lunch. He'd also started avoiding after-hours meetings, something completely out of character for him. And then there was the envelope. The mysterious blue envelope labeled Paul became the center of every theory. Forensics revealed it was a standard issue business envelope, the kind used in banks. But no fingerprints were found, not even Alistair's. It hadn't been torn open, and it contained nothing inside, just air. Some investigators believed it wasn't a message at all, it was a trigger, a pretext. The man at the door could have used it as a way to lure Alistair closer, to make him let his guard down. But others suspected the name Paul meant something. It wasn't random. There was no Paul in Alistair's family, no colleague, no friend. Yet weeks later, when detectives cross-referenced all the Pauls linked to the Nairn development dispute, one stood out: Paul McIntyre, a subcontractor who had gone bankrupt after a rejected loan application. McIntyre had a record of volatile behavior and had been seen arguing loudly in public about being ruined by the bank. But when police tracked him down, he was living quietly in Inverness. His alibi checked out, his DNA didn't match, and he swore he'd never even met Alistair Wilson. Still, the coincidence lingered like a shadow. Detective Inspector Norman MacLeod, one of the lead investigators, described the case as like chasing smoke. Every clue seemed solid until they reached out to grab it, then it vanished. But then came a breakthrough, not from Scotland, but from across the sea. In 2006, a crime analyst comparing cold cases noticed similarities between Alistair's murder and another killing in Northern Ireland. A doorstep shooting carried out with the same model of weapon, the same calm composure, and no trace left behind. Both crimes had ties, however faint, to financial disputes. The theory began to shift again. What if Alistair's murder wasn't personal at all, but professional? What if he had been the target of a contract killing? The contract theory fit the facts. The gun, a rare German pistol, wasn't typical street crime material. The timing, early evening, in a quiet neighborhood, suggested surveillance. The killer had known Alistair's routine, his name, his address, and that he'd answer the door personally. That required planning. But the motive still didn't align. Why Alistair? Why a mild-mannered banker from a quiet coastal town? That's when detectives unearthed something buried deep in old emails recovered from his office. Computer, a draft message never sent. It read, "There's something not right here. If I don't come home one day, check everything under Project Angel. Project Angel? The word stopped the investigation cold. No one knew what it meant. It wasn't a client name or a file or an internal code used at the bank. Yet the tone of the email was unmistakable. Alistair had been afraid. When investigators questioned his closest colleagues, most denied knowing anything about Project Angel. But one junior employee remembered hearing Alistair mention it briefly. He'd said it was something off the books. Police began to theorize that Alistair had uncovered something criminal, possibly money laundering, fraud, or corruption tied to development funds. Maybe he was about to blow the whistle. It explained his anxiety, his guardedness, his growing paranoia that someone was watching him. But proving that theory meant finding the paper trail. And by 2004, that was nearly impossible. The bank refused to release sensitive client records without a court order, citing privacy laws. And as months passed, pressure mounted to close the case. Then something eerie happened. In 2007, a local fisherman discovered a burned briefcase washed ashore near Nairn's harbor. Inside were charred fragments of documents bearing the Bank of Scotland letterhead. Forensic recovery was limited, but one fragment contained 2 legible words: Project Angel. It was real, and someone had gone to great lengths to destroy it. Investigators now believed Alistair had stumbled onto a financial crime, and that someone wanted him silenced. The problem was, everyone involved was either untouchable or already gone. Meanwhile, Veronica Wilson, now raising 2 sons alone, continued to speak publicly, pleading for justice. "Someone knows the truth," she said in a televised interview, her voice steady but hollow. "They're still out there." By 2014, a decade had passed, and the Wilson murder had joined the long list of unsolved Scottish homicides. But Detective MacLeod still refused to give up. He revisited the case file and made a discovery so subtle it had been overlooked for years. The blue envelope wasn't random stationery. It had been printed by a local hotel for conference correspondence. And the hotel? It was directly involved in the same development dispute Alistair had been reviewing before his death. Someone had handed that envelope to the killer, someone who wanted Alistair Wilson silenced before he could speak. The trail was warming again. But before police could follow it, another shocking piece of evidence surfaced, this time from inside the Wilson home itself. Veronica had finally decided to move. While packing, she found a small, sealed envelope wedged behind a drawer in her husband's study. It was the same blue as the one labeled Paul, but this one was addressed to Alistair himself.